And here, in terms of tilting that photo or whatever, well, actually I'm trying to indicate something about the water descending, and it is coming down, and to have things kind of fall and tumble into something does make it, it's both true and also, yes, visually rhetorical, you might say, and does have some of my Yiddish tones. And that's just because I'm informed about modern aesthetic practice. You wouldn't be doing this in the Victorian era, no.
The maps which compare Iraq to New York, Saudi Arabia to Pennsylvania based on their shape is totally a kind of alliteration. You know, here's a shape someplace else. And even this, it is, you know, it is formal. Let me think about these shapes. Let me design these shapes.
Well, in the case of that, that wasn't done by me at all. That was done by the British Colonial Office. They chose to make that parceling of territory.
Yes.
I just sort of noticed it, which is maybe also to say something about Boyce's statement about everybody's an artist. Or there's always art practice going on. Things are somehow this way or that way, if you were gestural.
Stein, she was maybe wrong, maybe right. She's usually right. But she had this fear, Gertrude, she had this fear that camouflage was developed because of her friends Braque and Picasso and Matisse, that military people studied what they were doing with Cubism and took that, and then it became this weapon. And one thing we, you know, somewhat disagree on to a point is, you know, I kind of think, or at times, you know, that there is technology and there's warfare, and, you know, the repercussions of that is art. And you often, you know, you say, you know, you believe that art has real power to influence those things. I'm wondering if you can talk about your ideas, your discoveries, both formal, topographical, and technological, the dangers of them being misused. Because that certainly goes on with current events we've talked about, where people have perhaps stolen your ideas and put them to dangerous effect. Do you feel liability or responsibility for these, you know, potentially earth-shattering ideas?
Well, first of all, the earth is already shattered. It's already in a very bad state. Everybody knows that. My daughter knows that very well. She's very alarmed. I think everybody is aware that we're coming into a strange condition. People are afraid of summer now. What's going to happen? So the shattering of the earth has happened. Now, how do we get back on track, so to speak? And I'd like to, therefore, this is sort of why I didn't want to be involved in that autonomia issue of semitext. I don't want to be seen as extreme. I actually want to be seen as somehow central. I'd like to have this guy be able to recognize this and say, maybe not without doing the German colors, and say, would you argue or agree that this basin shape is the shape of your macro region? I haven't seen his image, and so on and so forth. What's very important now is for the artists who have been making this and that signals, I have, and there are other artists, I'm not alone, to bring the work into public light for policy review so we can deal with things in a timely manner. Let's talk about Iran. In 1978, and you know, people don't know this fact. People who worked with John Gibson, whom I met a few days ago, did not know this fact. In 1978, Dennis Oppenheim had work, earthworks proposals, flown by military jet, Iranian military jet, from this area, I think New Jersey, to Iran, to be built by the Iranian military for more or less ecological purposes, long term. The idea is it would be a functioning earthwork of some sort. They didn't quite know what it would be, but they had some belief that it would work out somehow. And you could call that a hallucination, if you want, or a fantasy. And I will say, I don't really, it doesn't blind faith, but I would say, hey, it might work, let's go for it. Does it work? I don't know. Let's try it. Now, that was the intention of the Iranian government under the Shah. If that had gone ahead, if they had built those works, and they were going to do that in the UN Environmental Park in Shiraz, if there had been any kind of understanding that earthworks could, in fact, do something about the ecology and about the salt flats, as was kind of implied in Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson, and it's certainly been espoused in a different way by the Harrisons. Okay? There's a lot of fighting about how practical it can be, but certainly, if something had happened in Iran, you would not be having the present almost absurd game about who's got the nuclear weapons and are we really going to attack and who we're going to bomb next. The discourse with Iran would be very, very different. So I think it's very important now at this moment historically, in Washington, in Moscow, in Cairo, in Tehran, to raise attention to those works that were sent to Iran and say, well, they can actually be worked on, and we should see what they can be, what value they can be, and if they can't be tested in Iran, we can test them in some other part of the world. Now that is pretty much the point of, and I'm trying to get to a piece here in the show. Let's say over here, right here. This idea here. Now, talking about military. As I don't really show it here, but the reason I'm able to make this diagram for what might be done down by the Shat al-Arab, by Basra, Iran's second biggest city, Abadan, the big refinery city of Iran, and on the Iran-Iraq border, which is right here on this black line. The reason I have made this discussion is that there's been a lot of work with satellite imaging of that area, and we know that there has been a lot of major construction. That construction was on this huge scale, and as we show in our videotape, which you have a copy of, it appears to be very similar to work by American earth artists. It was all done by Russian engineers for Iraq back in the 1980s. The objective now, it seems to me historically, is to say to Iran, to Iraq, to these countries, we propose, just as there is a U.S. State Department initiative for the Yangtze River basin in the Mississippi, scientific exchange, which is why the U.S., in a very curiously, I think, wonderful way, was opposed to Three Gorges Dam for ecological reasons. We, the United States, also have a parallel program in the Rio Grande with the Yellow River in China, which has a very serious, similar ecological problem. We can have a constructive relation with China about that. So here in this region, we can say, we, the United States, happen to have the Colorado River, which has dams and eutrophication, drought, and so on, and we can parallel that with the Tigris-Euphrates in this kind of parallel practice, and we can work with all the Arab countries in this area, and work with both Mexico and the U.S. in this area, to develop practices, and then test somewhere or other, I'm not quite sure, those earthworks which have been sent to Iran, to test them in these areas down here in the head of the Gulf, and to also test the idea of, to use an Oppenheimer term, time pocket between two countries, an area that would be somehow an ecological park. Now we can propose these things based on a whole precedent of works having been sent there with the intention of being built for more or less environmental purposes by the same Iranian military that we are now so scared of. These facts can be brought to the fore. I am not operating as some kind of lone person trying to be a hero. I'm operating with a huge historical legacy of people who did make proposals, things that were started, and so on. They were only interrupted by some historical mishap, in this case, in 1978, the expiration of the 25-year consortium contract. So then they had the occupation of the embassy and so on. But that would be a much more effective way of dealing with Iran than having the current saber-rattling discussion about do we go to war or not, and do we have a big fight or not. Well, that's a big fact. And this, I think, needs to happen, where we have the recognition that art is historically relevant, it is historically present, and it can be put to use. And many things that I show here are already pre-existing artwork.